Welcome back to another episode of Time to Chat with Dr. Judith. I'm, of course, joined by Dr. Judith Mooring today. Very excited to be back for our third episode. We closed out the end of last week, neurodiversity. Wow, that's a big word. Neurodiversity Celebration Week.
We did.
Let's reflect on that, Judith. Tell me, what did you get up to last week?
It was a really, really busy week, Hamish. It was brilliant. Really good to be with a number of different businesses and also to be on an academic committee talking about ADHD and to see the interest and the enthusiasm that people have for neurodiversity was fantastic. So we've also had quite a few bookings for ADHD Answers, so places are filling up, which is great. So that's our neuroscience-informed ADHD education program for professionals, and that starts on the 23rd of April.
Nice.
So we're looking to fill that up, which is brilliant. And that's off the back of all this interest, because ADHD has been all over the news the last week or two, hasn't it? It's been everywhere. It's been in the Times. It's been on government agendas. It's been everywhere. So that's been a real surprise to me, having been an expert in the area for a long time, just how interested everybody is and also how much information people need.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about this before, but it feels like there's a lot of information out there, a lot of noise, potentially.
There's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, some of the information on social media is good, some of it's not. So we just had a conversation this morning, didn't we, about cheese-based treatments for ADHD. Cheese is not a treatment for ADHD.
What, are you saying I can't leave the Ritalin at home and just get onto the cheese?
No, cheese will not treat ADHD. So
probably upset my tummy as well, to be fair. So
yes, exactly. so there's a lot of misinformation about ADHD around. And there's also a lot of, can you give me a kind of hot take? And I can give you a hot take, but ADHD is not about hot takes, because the brain, I don't know about yours, but my brain, everybody's brains is complex. Brains are complex things. And so there's a tendency, I think, for us all to be a bit black and white, a bit like, well, ADHD is overdiagnosed and ADHD is just too much TV and ADHD is naughty boys. And hang on a minute, it's not. Neurodiversity is complex, ADHD is complex, the brain is complex. So just slowing down a bit and taking our time to understand it's so important.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, really interesting. And I guess that's possibly why you're seeing all of this interest is, you've got the neuroscience basis, you've got the clinical expertise, you've had the experience, not just as a psychiatrist, but living with ADHD. It's now people are going, we need someone who actually knows what they're talking about to guide us through.
And I find, even as someone who knows what they're talking about, I'm learning all the time. So I wrote ADHD Answers precisely because I wanted the answers myself to what does the neuroscience say? How do we link these different pieces together? Because it's complex. I was teaching clinicians, and I can teach about medication, I can teach about meditation, teach about lots of different things, but actually how do we link all the bits of evidence together so that we've got more of a big picture view of what's complex? And one of the things, that I said we were going to touch on today is it's the 5-year anniversary, isn't it?
It is, yeah. 5 years since COVID.
Yeah.
So
was that the same in New Zealand?
We had, so I think that was the 26th, I think. So it must be Wednesday.
Yeah.
Was our 5-year, I don't want to call it an anniversary because that feels like something you want to celebrate. It feels like commiserate.
Yeah.
But yeah, the 5-year kind of marking of when we had our first big lockdown, and quite proud as a Kiwi to say I feel like we did COVID fairly well. So it's easy to kind of exist in a bubble and think doesn't really matter. It was fine. We moved on. But tell me about your experiences and what you think.
So in the UK, certainly it was very, very real. It sadly caused many deaths. It was extremely traumatic. And I think that's the point I want to make today, is that it's the 5-year anniversary of the first lockdowns in the UK following COVID arriving here and infecting so many people. And it was both a tragedy in terms of, the very, very sad deaths that we saw, but also it was traumatic. And the trauma is defined as anything that we experience as a threat to life, something that's potentially could threaten us with death or injury. And that's the awful thing about COVID, is it was genuinely traumatic, because we weren't just scared, we were also at risk and people died. So it's a genuine trauma. And people don't want to talk about it. That's fine. We don't need to talk about it, but we do need to understand that mental health exists in a social context.
Okay.
Yeah. And that the brain, we said the brain is complex, but it exists in this context. And we know when we look at trauma and we understand trauma, there are areas of the brain involved in ADHD, like the default mode network, which are also implicated in how we understand trauma and trauma responses. So people with a traumatic response have some differences in their default mode network wiring. So there's similarities there.
Interesting, because I think it's easy to look back at history and go, oh, the 1940s, you know, there were literally bombs falling out of the sky. People were terrified for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense, you know, people were going to war, they came back, they had PTSD. PTSD became something that was explored.
Yeah, well, it evolved after the First World War with shell shocks.
Right.
First World War shell shock psychiatry arose from the how do we understand trauma. Previously, psychiatry and psychotherapy was very much about sort of women's mental health and hysteria, but now it's like men coming back from war, these strong men in a real state. And that was the trauma response after the First World War, and obviously the Second World War as well. This place we're in today was actually bombed in the Second World War.
Was it?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. The basement survived, the rest of the house didn't. So
we're in a safe spot, which is good to know.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
But yeah, so trauma responses have a genuine impact on mental health. And I'm not saying that ADHD is all trauma. It's not. It's not black and white. But brain interacts with environment. The brain is plastic. It changes. And when you have something as big as COVID, people's brains will adapt in some way. And I think some people have found that their ADHD symptoms got much worse in the context of the stress of COVID and the lack of structure of COVID.
Yeah.
So we know that rates of awareness are going up massively at the moment, which is really good. But also people are suffering probably more with their ADHD because of the stress, the post-COVID trauma, the lack of structure that happened during the pandemic. It's a complex mix, isn't it?
It really is a complex mix. And I think there's something really interesting to be said about that as well, because I think for a lot of people, COVID was a big transition from potentially how they worked, or maybe how they went to school, or how, in my instance, how I was at uni. Like, you come out the other side and things have kind of gone back to normal, but there's been big shifts. And I think I'm curious to see, you know, those lifestyle changes and kind of bigger changes in life, how you think that affects people, particularly neurodiverse people or people with ADHD.
Well, we know that people have become more aware of neurodiversity because of basically being able to search up neurodiversity online. So increased awareness, increased education. As I say, and the changes of the pandemic made a big difference to many people, but I think particularly for neurodivergent people, for people with ADHD, the loss, and for people with autism, the loss of structure was really significant. The stress that we all went through, we know that neurodivergent people with ADHD, more at risk of mental health conditions, so potentially more unmasking of mental health conditions with all that stress. And so it was a big impact. We can't ignore the impact of COVID on neurodiversity now. And actually, to be honest, the impact of COVID on all of us, whether we're neurodivergent or neurotypical, it was a genuine trauma. So that's why I wanted to sort of mark it and notice it, because when we forget about important things, we miss sometimes the obvious.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? You kind of think, and I think, again, coming back to the war example, I think it's really clear in everybody's mind that was a really traumatic experience for the world. And I think it can be easy to go, oh, well, you just sat at home. You just worked from home.
Yeah, but there were plenty of people who were not just working from home. There were people working on the front lines in healthcare. There were people working on the front lines in face-to-face roles. There were people became very ill. People died. People still long-term sick with long COVID. So there's lots and lots of interactions there. And we all move through the world at such high speed that we forget sometimes to situate ourselves in a kind of historical context and go, gosh, that was big. That was huge. That's going to have an impact. That's going to resonate somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something so interesting about that as well. I reflect now 5 years later. I'm remembering the day it all happened in New Zealand, or the day before, thinking, oh my God, we're all just going to, you know, everything's going to stop. And then we all woke up the next morning. And the only thing you could do was go to the supermarket other than just staying in your house. And it was like, it's at the time, it was so kind of normalized. And you think now, 5 years on, if I was told to do that tomorrow, I think
it's a big issue.
It'd be a big issue. And it's only 5 years, but you forget. Yeah, you forget how big it was.
It was enormous and enormously stressful, enormously scary. And again, going back to the neuroscience, we know the brain is designed to keep us safe. So we respond very quickly through something called the quick and dirty fear mechanism. We respond very quickly with the amygdala adapting. And so we all adapted, but actually that comes at a price in terms of our ability to do some of the more focused things, some of the more focused sort of central executive network functions of the brain. And the default mode network changes. It changes the way that we cope when we experience repeated fear and trauma to keep us safe. It's an adaptation response. It's a healthy thing, but it will mean some people who perhaps didn't have, they coped better, they managed with their previous structure, their previous support, the impact of COVID will have unmasked some of their neurodiversity, may have exacerbated some of their ADHD symptoms. I'm not saying it's causing it, I'm just saying there is a link. So it's really important that we don't slip into kind of black and white, it's this or it's that. The brain is complex. There are no easy answers, and it's all about learning more, understanding more. Where there is an easy answer, or where there are simple answers, the things that are good for one mental health condition are often good for others. So I talk a lot about nature. I talked a lot about slowing down, social connection, nature, exercise, mindfulness. Those are the things that are really powerful for all of us, whether we're recovering from PTSD or ADHD or depression. They're all evidence-based. We don't use them anywhere near enough. And I think if we could link neuroscience with those simple bits of lifestyle psychiatry, and really link them and go, oh, I understand the brain, I understand how this particular thing is helping. It would help us to come back to the things that really do help. It's Mental Health Awareness Week later in May, and that's all about connection and community. And those things are so important when it comes to overcoming big issues like trauma. So
I really liked that point where you said just then, understanding the connection between the natural things you can do, so they're part of lifestyle changes, and the neuroscience behind it. For me, I'm a very black and white thinker, fact-based kind of, this is this, therefore this. And it can be really easy to go, well, go for a walk, it makes you feel better. And I go, well,
what's the science?
That's not helpful because I can't measure that. Whereas
well, we can measure it, and we know that it does help. And we also know things like, for instance, exercise. Exercise is evidence-based for ADHD. It's evidence-based for depression. We've got good evidence it reduces certain aspects of PTSD as well. And when you look into the neuroscience of why, you go, well, that makes sense because it's enhancing levels of neurotransmitters. And that is similar to the sorts of things that we do with medication. So you see similarities when we provide these really sort of common sense treatments. They are actually really, really powerful. If we understand, particularly if we understand why we're doing them. And that's the key thing. So
coming back to ADHD, where can people come to learn about the neuroscience?
Well, we've got an awareness session, I think, haven't we, an information session for people on the 9th of April. The 9th of April. So if you're interested to learn more about how we can support people with ADHD using this science-based approach, but providing practical lifestyle advice that you can use straight away, then join us on the 9th. And I think that one's a freebie, isn't it?
It is, yes. We're doing an hour-long session on the 9th. You can ask your questions directly of Judith in real time. And then, obviously we've got ADHD Answers launched on the 23rd of April.
ADHD Answers launched just on the 23rd of April, and we're using this exact approach, which is, let's have a look at the neuroscience. Let's understand what we currently know. And obviously it's going to evolve because we're learning more and more, neuroscience is adapting. But what do we currently understand underpins the experience of ADHD, and how can we use that one-to-one in coaching, in therapy, in mental health environments, or as someone with ADHD? How can we apply the science practically alongside other things like medication? But how can we empower ourselves? And that's ADHD Answers on the 23rd of April.
I like that. And that's the 6 sessions, is it? So it's
6 sessions online. It's 6 sessions online because that's how adults learn best, is short, sharp. So it's 90 minutes per session, and you'll learn a lot in those sessions, and you'll reflect a lot.
Nice.
That's the goal, is that it's embedded adult learning that you will take with you, because that's the best way that adults learn.
Nice. And that's quite a small group session, isn't it?
Yes, so we're running it so that people can reflect and engage within. There'll be groups of 15 working together to reflect on the topics. Yeah,
and I understand spaces are getting quite filled.
We're filling up now, which is great.
Okay, cool.
And we've got a mixture of clinicians, coaches, people who work in addiction services, people who work in psychology, and some of those people also have ADHD and some don't. But we're building up a nice group to work together, which should be really good.
Cool. So this is a call to action. You can book now, right? And
you can book now, and you can scan also if you're interested in following more, because we're going to have more content coming out, because ADHD is an evolving area. The understanding is evolving. And it's my mission to try and share more and more evidence-based information with people. So you can scan there to learn more.
Scan the QR code. You can pop in your email address, and then you'll not miss any more of the updates about when the courses are and kind of how to get involved in the freebies.
Yeah, brilliant.
Wonderful. Well, next week we are taking a little bit of a break from the Time to Chat, so keep an eye out on all your channels. We've got LinkedIn, YouTube, and on the website. We'll upload next time we're going live again.
Yeah.
But in the interim, we'd love to see you at our next free sessions or at ADHD Answers.
Yeah, brilliant.
Wonderful. Have a lovely week, everyone.